It's a hard reality that some industries don't seem especially well suited to competition. Either the firms repeatedly push each other into suffering large losses, or the production technology of the industry makes competition difficult to imagine. Let me give you a couple of examples where this often comes up. One is railroads in the late 19th century. Another is airlines in the late 20th century. Let's talk about railroads for a moment. It seemed at first like there were huge profits to be made in the railroad industry in the late 19th century, and vast amounts of track were laid. But once the track was laid, the additional marginal cost of shipping over that track was relatively low. So, once that had happened, some railroad firms without much competition could charge high prices, make high profits, pay large dividends, and then build more rail. So, for example, between 1880 and 1882, there were 29,000 miles of railroad track laid in the U.S., which increased the total track in the U.S. by 1/3 in just those 3 years. Then competition between all those railroads drove the prices way down, so firms were unable to pay for the track they'd laid. In fact, half of the railroad track built by private firms before 1900 was being run by the bankruptcy courts in 1900. Now sure, in any dynamic market, some firms will do well and some firms will do poorly. But what happens when an entire industry seems to run itself into the ground? For a more modern example, let's think about the situation of the big airlines in the United States. Remember back in the 1970s, when the airline industry was deregulated and there was a burst of competition from new firms like People Express. But more recently, big airlines like United and American, Northwest, Delta seem to be losing money almost every year, and a lot of money. Older firms like Pan Am and Braniff and TWA have gone broke. Southwest has consistently made money, and some regional niche airlines have done all right a few years now and then. But what happens when an entire industry, at least most of the industry's firms, seem to be running itself into the ground? To many people in the late 1800s, it seemed obvious that we needed to have government regulation of railroads to prevent the railroads from driving themselves into the bankruptcy courts. And we did do that for most of the 20th century. In fact, for most of the 20th century, the U.S. regulated both railroads and airlines. Another example of a firm where competition doesn't work very well is public utilities. A public utility is a firm that is technically privately owned, but is closely regulated by the government in terms of the prices that it charges and the kinds of services it provides. It provides a commodity used by almost every home, like water or electricity or phone service. Indeed, for much of the 20th century, these private utilities, the water companies, electricity companies, the phone company, had prices and in many cases the level of service set by government regulators. Why is it that competition isn't working well in some of these industries? Why is it that government regulation seems so useful in some of these industries? Well, if you think about the water company for a moment and think what it would mean to have competition among water companies. Imagine that you had 4 or 5 water companies and they each had their own pipes. So you had 4 or 5 identical sets of pipes under the city, one for every company, so every household could choose its own provider of water. It'd be terribly costly to install all those duplicative systems of pipes. In fact, all of these industries, railroads, airlines, the others I've mentioned, where competition seems not to be working very well, have a common underlying economic characteristic. They involve networks of some kind, either transportation networks in the case of railroads and airlines, or networks for distributing water and electricity. They tend to have a high cost of building the network. And then, once the network is built, a relatively low cost of running the network. In the term that we used before in an earlier lecture, they form a natural monopoly. Remember, a natural monopoly exists when an industry has large economies of scale, so that a big, large established firm can produce at a lower average cost than any new entrants that come into the market. After all, the larger firm already has its network in place. It's paid for its network, and so now it can provide service at a fairly low cost. It's going to be very hard for a new entrant to come in. If that entrant comes in at a very small size, it won't have the big network. It won't be able to compete effectively. But if you just let the big company alone, then you're going to end up with a monopoly. Or alternatively, if you get a big entrant, if another water company tried to enter to compete with the water companies, or big airlines tried to enter, you end up with this scenario of ruinous competition, where the two really large firms both have very high fixed costs of providing their network, and when they charge low prices, they run each other into the ground. The result of this kind of tough competition is that both firms can end up driving each other into bankruptcy, or else they merged into a single firm and then we're back to monopoly again. Some of you who saw the popular 2004 movie The Aviator will recognize this argument as what the senator, played by Alan Alda, says to the Howard Hughes character, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. Basically says, look, Pan Am needs to have a monopoly over international air flights, because monopoly will serve the consumer better than having competition with TWA. That argument sounds like a bad guy argument in the movie, but there's some economic logic behind it. Now, society has various options for regulating an industry where competition doesn't seem to work well or where a natural monopoly might exist. And these different types of regulation will have different incentives for producers. So let me try and discuss some of the possible regulatory options. One option would be take the large company and break it into multiple competitors. But in the particular case we're discussing here, that isn't going to work very well. Remember, the reason that you have the big company in the first place is that the big company can produce at a low average cost. If you break it into small pieces, then each piece is going to be produced at a higher average cost. The small competitors can't take advantage of the same economies of scale. Those small competitors will either collude together as a monopoly, which isn't good, or they'll viciously compete and drive each other into bankruptcy, which is the problem we're sort of trying to avoid. So let me put this in a little more intuitive terms. If you're worried about the water company being a monopoly, setting up a duplicate water company is going to be wasteful, and the eventual result will either be back to monopoly again or ruinous competition between these two networks of water companies. So, if we're not going to try and break up these big companies, what's the next possibility? A possibility is called cost-plus regulation. And cost-plus regulation is more or less what it sounds like. It is setting a regulated price that the firm is allowed to charge by first calculating its cost of production, allowing for sort of the low normal level of profit that a competitive firm would make, and then setting the price to cover that cost plus a little bit of profit amount. This has been historically the most common method of setting prices for public utilities. It was also the method in which prices were set for the airlines and for the railroads for a long time. State commissions set these prices. And in fact, if you go back to 1887, which was the Interstate Commerce Act that first started regulating railroads, that's how they set the price for what would be carried on railroads from the late 1800s for almost a century up until the 1970s. When the airline industry was regulated by the Civil Aeronautics Board, that was how the Civil Aeronautics Board set prices for the airline industry through this cost-plus regulation. Now, what incentives does cost-plus regulation provide? Imagine that you're a producer and you're reimbursed for your costs plus a little bit more. Well, at a minimum, you have less reason to be concerned with your high costs. Because if you have high costs, you have cost-plus regulation. Those costs get passed along in the form of higher prices. Even worse, firms under cost-plus regulation have an incentive to generate high costs. An electrical company that's being regulated by cost-plus regulation might want to build huge electrical plants or employ lots and lots of staff, because what they can charge is linked to the costs that they incur. Moreover, you've got essentially no reason to innovate. After all, if you innovate in a way that saves a lot of money, what's going to happen? Well, cost plus regulation, your costs are lower, you're going to charge less, you don't come out ahead. So cost plus regulation sort of sounds like a reasonable way to regulate. In practice, the incentives it provides are not very attractive. What's the alternative? Well, the best alternative right now is probably something called price cap regulation. The idea of price cap regulation is that the regulator sets a price that the regulated firm can charge that extends out several years into the future. If the firm can cut costs by more than it predicts, then it could earn profits because it's guaranteed that it can charge that price for several years into the future. I first became aware of price cap regulation when they began trying it out in the California telephone market in the 1980s. What they did there was they sort of set the price cap by saying, let's look at what everyone is charging for phone service in other places. We're expecting the price of phone service to drop over time because of technological developments in the telecommunications industry. So we're going to look at other firms, we're going to look at the technology, and we're going to say, okay, we expect the phone price to drop over time, and your price cap is actually declining over time. In a way, we're going to create a kind of virtual competition. We're going to say what our expectation is of lower prices, and then we're going to force you to try and meet that expectation of lower prices over time. In that case, you can force a declining price of phone service over time. And the regulated firm is okay with that because if it has the freedom to cut its costs and earn profit, it can actually still make a profit even with the price going down over time. So the incentives of price cap regulation, where you set the price cap based on other firms and based on expectations of technological improvement, can actually be much better than the cost-plus approach. But any method of regulation faces the danger of what's called regulatory capture. The regulatory capture is the danger that regulators will start believing their job is to protect the industry profits and the industry workers rather than to protect competition and consumers. Now, if public utilities were all regulated by economist saints, then some form of price cap regulation with benchmarking might work pretty well. But government regulators are appointed by politicians. And so you have to say to yourself, who's going to get appointed? Who's actually going to be the regulator? Who is going to obsessively follow every action of the Public Utility Commission, every tiny little bit of fine print, every twist and turn and rule, and keep track of who's likely to be appointed? Who's going to make friends with the people on the commission? Who's going to provide those people on the commission with information and background and maybe a nice trip now and then, and maybe even a well-paid job after they leave the regulatory commission? Well, of course, the firms being regulated are the ones who are going to focus on all of those things. In a way, a regulatory commission is a little bit like those people who get kidnapped and then they begin to sympathize with their kidnappers, the Stockholm Syndrome, I think they call it. Even if the regulators start off saying, I'm really determined to get the best possible deal for consumers, it's very easy over time for regulators to start sympathizing with the people they're regulating. After all, if you're a regulator, and you start off from the belief that unfettered competition is just not likely to work very well in this market. It's likely to be vicious and unrestrained, leading to disruptions of key services, and you really need regulation, then it's only a tiny short step to feeling like it's your public duty to make sure that firms get safe and steady profits. Now, of course, you could say, well, the profits shouldn't be bloated or exorbitant, and there should be nice public service advertisements and that sort of thing. But regulators almost always end up providing nice, steady, almost guaranteed profits. If you're going to regulate, you need to feel like the industry is important, and so you can't drive it into bankruptcy, right? And if you feel that way, it gets very hard to be a tough price cap regulator who sets tough price caps over time. The other option, when you think about how to regulate an industry, is not to regulate it, to deregulate it, to remove the regulations. And the US economy experienced a wave of deregulation in a number of industries in the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. Some of the industries that were deregulated at that time included airlines, banking, trucking, oil, intercity bus travel, phone equipment, long-distance phone service, and the railroads, too. Now, when these industries were deregulated, they definitely stopped being nice, neat, orderly markets where the firms got a certain level of profit year in and year out. But it's also true that consumers benefited greatly from deregulation, both in lower prices and in terms of new goods and services. The number of choices for consumers mushroomed. The airlines reorganized themselves after deregulation into these hub and spoke systems, where people flew into one airport and flew out again. The result was that it was much more easy for people to connect to a bunch of different places than it had been before, and the number of airline connections went way up. trucks set up similar hub and spoke delivery systems where trucks collected stuff and took them to a hub and then reloaded and sent them out to other places again. Think about deregulation in banking, which brought with it this wide range of automatic teller machines and flexible financial services. Think about deregulation of telecommunications and the incredible explosion in telecommunications technology. Now, it's of course really easy to say, well, that's just technology. I mean, the new technology would have happened anyway. We would have gotten mobile phones anyway. We would have gotten automatic teller machines anyway. The technology was on the way. But are you really so sure? I mean, after all, AT&T had kept pretty much one style of phone and one color black for many, many, many decades. It's not obvious to me that they would have suddenly expanded into a whole bunch of different kinds of telephone service. I mean, after all, what reasons did a regulated company like AT&T have to try and produce radical innovations that it wasn't even clear consumers wanted? Only profit-seeking firms take those big chances to try to please consumers. Regulated monopolies really don't try those things quite so often. When planes were deregulated, when airlines were deregulated, they flew much fuller most of the time. A result was there were lower costs and lower consumer prices, prices that are on average about 1/3 lower as a result of deregulation. When trucking was deregulated, the trucks now drive many fewer empty miles, and the cost to shippers fell by about 1/3. When railroads were deregulated, they shut down a lot of track that was barely being used, and the prices to shippers over railroads fell by almost half. If you add these kinds of examples to the other industries that were deregulated, by the end of the 1990s, the US Great Deregulation Experiment of the 1970s was saving consumers about $50 billion a year in lower prices. Now, yes, deregulation made the business environment less stable for regulated firms, but they had to worry about whether or not they were going to go out of business. They didn't have those assured profits anymore. Some executives and workers of those firms who had pretty nice, comfortable positions in the old regulated industries have really suffered. And I would say, I have sympathy for the people who suffered in the aftermath of deregulation. Their suffering was real. But to be a little bit tough-minded about it, it's not clear to me why the rest of society owed people in those regulated industries $50 billion a year in higher prices so they could have more secure and higher-paid jobs. Indeed, often jobs in some of those regulated industries, like airlines, paid wages that were well above the average wage for a worker. So the redistribution was going from those with average incomes or below average incomes to those with above average incomes. Now, I'm very comfortable with the idea that the government should help the poor, should help the unemployed, should help those who lose their jobs with some combination of income assistance and health care and training. But I am not comfortable with the idea that the government owes a group of high-income workers some set of rules on pricing that will restrict competition and force everyone to pay higher prices, so the lucky few people in that industry can have high-income jobs forever. Every time the government reduces a subsidy, after all, the person formerly receiving the subsidy suffers. But that doesn't mean subsidies should never be cut off. In the case of deregulation, some of those receiving the benefits of regulation did suffer, but that doesn't mean deregulation shouldn't have happened. Can these lessons of deregulation be extended to other industries? Even in cases where some regulation is needed, regulated industries might have one or more parts that could be carved off and left to competitive market forces. Maybe the best example of carving off some competitive pieces is the breakup of the former telephone monopolist AT&T. Remember, it was broken up into a long-distance firm, a telephone equipment firm, and several local phone companies. AT&T had a bunch of different pieces. And in that breakup of AT&T, when it turned into 7 different local phone companies across the regions of the US, a long-distance company, an equipment company, and a research company, all those firms became more competitive and more innovative as a result. The hope at the time was that the local phone companies would start competing with each other, but that's been relatively slow to happen. Now, however, with cell phones and wireless phone service, we're beginning to see a lot more competition even in the local phone market, which has brought down prices in the phone market and had a huge growth of new technology. There have been all sorts of new innovations. You can imagine other settings where an infusion of competition might help. Imagine a large city which has been providing its own garbage service for a long time. Now, garbage service is something where the network kind of kicks in. When a garbage truck goes down a street, it's cost effective to pick up everyone's garbage on the same day. And it might be cost effective to have only one or two big garbage dumps or big recycling plants. Still, what you can do in garbage collection is split the city into regions. Have firms bid on garbage collection for each region. Then after a few years, check on the performance and the cost and encourage competition as these firms would compete for collecting garbage in different parts of the city. Another way you could carve off some of city services. You can carve off things like cleaning services or repair services or cafeteria services, office supply services, building maintenance, laundry, renting of office space. Those are all things that don't need to be provided by one government provider, but instead could be provided in a more competitive way by a lot of local governments. Electricity has long been thought of as a natural monopoly and regulated as a public utility. But the argument there is essentially that there's a grid of wires that brings electricity to homes, and that grid creates one big network that makes sense to be owned centrally by one company. But that argument about the grid doesn't focus on how the electrical power is generated. So the idea of deregulating electricity is the electrical grid would continue to be regulated or publicly owned, but the business of producing electrical energy would become more competitive. This concern often has something of an environmentalist tinge, since the idea might be that wind power or solar power could be sold to the big electricity grid. Now, since 1989, the United Kingdom has tried out a variety of market arrangements for having electricity generators compete with each other. A number of US states have also experimented with electricity deregulation in the 1990s. Some have had a lot of success. Pennsylvania is an example. And some have had near disastrous consequences, California being the example. In fact, California had a true debacle with deregulating electricity in the early 2000s, which was so heavily publicized and so terrible that it's probably poisoned the water for major electricity deregulation in the next few years. Economists can explain until they're blue in the face that the regulatory system California set up, which basically required state power utilities to buy electricity at the market rate, but to sell to consumers at a regulated rate, was extraordinarily foolish. If the purchase price went way up, the selling price didn't, they were all going to go broke. The system lacked safeguards against being gamed by the electricity producers, who could find ways to allow or encourage the market price to rise, then sell at that high price. But what California really proves is that foolish regulation can be really, really costly, which is not exactly a new lesson. The answer is smarter deregulation. Broadband internet access has some of the traits of a natural monopoly. Again, it can be provided by setting up a network that has high fixed costs, running cable into everybody's home. This trait has led some cities in particular to argue that it should be provided by a regulated monopoly. But you know, the broadband internet industry also has some potential for competition. In many areas, you could get your internet service, your home internet service, from the cable TV company, that cable, or over the phone from various providers. There are even wireless phones now which could provide high-speed internet. In many areas, electricity and the water companies also own fiber optic cables that, at least in theory, could provide internet service to an awful lot of people. And of course, the wireless internet networks that have been made up of many local nodes are happening in a lot of areas now. I've even seen suggestions for what are essentially high-flying blimps that would hover over a metro area and act sort of like a low-flying satellite to provide high-speed internet to everyone in a city. Now, I'm certainly not foolish enough to make some firm prediction about the future of broadband internet technology and what should be the right way to provide it. But I do want to say that some people, especially politicians in certain cities, are really very darn quick to assume that public provision or a regulated monopoly with one provider fits all is the best answer. Now, maybe they'll turn out to be right. Maybe the technology will go that way. But I'm really not at all sure that that argument that we have to have one local provider to provide all the internet service is justified in economic terms. When it comes to a rapidly evolving future technology, It's often better to encourage a multiplicity of technologies that can compete against each other, rather than locking into one and saying this is the one that's going to be followed. Government has a necessary role as a referee of economic competition. The forces of competition accomplish a great deal that is socially beneficial. They provide new products and innovation with pressure to produce those things at low costs and in a way that consumers are going to like. But in certain well-defined circumstances, when competition isn't working well or can't work well, government can have a useful role to play. I should emphasize, though, that when I talk about deregulation, I don't mean no regulation at all. After all, when government allows firms to set their own prices and set their own quantities produced, it can still set standards that involve things like safety or accuracy or open disclosure. For example, just because you deregulate the airlines, you can still regulate the airlines in terms of safety and inspections for safety. Just because you allow banks to charge whatever, or pay and charge whatever interest rates they want, you can still regulate the banks and make sure the banks are being run in a financially prudent manner and audit their books and all those kinds of things. If the issue is to help the poor in some cases, for example, if the issue is to assure that there's no digital divide, as they sometimes call it, that low-income folks all have home access to broadband internet, I'm open to discussion on the best way to do that. But it's not obvious to me that requiring everyone to sign up with a regulated monopoly is the best answer. The best answer might be that if you really believe that's an important public service, provide income to poor people or pay for their broadband internet from a selection of providers who compete against each other. The real trick here is that when the outcomes of market forces seem undesirable, it's important to identify the underlying problem in a specific way and to design the policy response accordingly. For example, is the problem that there's a competitive industry or an industry that would be competitive except that the firms in that industry have formed a cartel? Well, if that's the problem, then go after the cartel and break it up. Use your antitrust laws. Is the problem that it's a restrictive business practice and it seems to be blocking competition? Well, go after that